As you know, the topic for today, we're calling it rebuilding civility in the workplace. And you might first ask yourself, why are we talking about civility in the workplace? What does that even mean? And I think because you're attending today, you probably understand and have a sense of that. But the best example I can give is if you look at the United States Congress as a workplace, you will find a complete lack of civility. And that's not a political statement on either side on party lines. It's just, if you look at that as a workplace example, which it is, we want to avoid that. There's so many studies and so much research to show the benefits of a civil and respectful workplace. And that's really what we want to get to. So today, what we're going to do, I'm just going to briefly introduce myself, and we're going to talk about what civility means. What are we talking about when we say civility or respectful workplace? We're going to do a short breakout session first, where we'll talk about a couple of these issues and then come back and debrief. We'll get into the concept of civility and respect, how that can evolve into a higher level of workplace bullying, and then how that itself can lead to a higher level of legal risk with harassment and discrimination. And we'll see how there's kind of a continuum and a pathway. And then we'll get into what a civil and respectful workplace actually looks like, and why it's important. We'll have our second breakout session. And then the big question, how do we get there? We know it's important. We know it's what we want to get to, but how do we do it? And then we'll get to some final questions and wrap up. So first, real briefly, just so you have my background, I went to Penn State undergrad, labor and employee relations degree, Villanova Law for my law degree. Started out pretty traditionally as a labor and employment attorney in California with Littler, and then back home to Philly at Blank Rome, moved in-house to AstraZeneca as employment counsel for them. And it was at that point that I really made kind of a life-changing decision to move from the legal department over to HR. And the reason for that was I found that my passion really was with building culture and building a workplace environment based on respect and empathy and civility. It wasn't the term that we used then, but so I kind of made that move over to HR and have been in there ever since. And as most of you know, there's a fine line between HR and the law, because so much in human resources is based directly or indirectly on legal requirements and legal obligations. So I've kind of always had one foot in the door. At Decision One, I was general counsel and VP of HR. So there's always been, that aspect of it, that it's been kind of a crossover. But you see there, I've kind of led a number of different HR transformations in different industries, but the common theme in all of them was really twofold. And that was, number one, we needed to get the HR function closely aligned with the business objectives of the organization so we could be a true value add. And number two, we needed to build a respectful workplace culture. And they went hand in hand. They were equally important. And so that was kind of my mission with each of those roles. And then for the last 17 years or so, I've been teaching at Villanova in their master's program in HR, teaching employment law and foundations of strategic HR management. So a little over a year ago, showing my brilliant business acumen, I decided to go out on my own and start a company, with a global pandemic knocking on my door. But employment practice outsourcing kind of takes that mix, and I kind of call it where the law meets HR. And so we focus on bringing that expertise of the knowledge, the hard legal knowledge and compliance, with the practical perspective of sitting in the seat of the HR leader, and things like workplace investigations, training, employee relations support, designing HR functions, and providing a HR advisory kind of unlimited support model for smaller organizations. So that's what we're all about. That's what I've been up to for the last 14 months or so. And one of the reasons I joined Beacon, as a lot of you know, is to just make more contacts, expand my network, and it's been so helpful, and everybody's been so wonderful so far in that regard. So enough about me. I want to really start to dig in and ask the question, what is civility in the workplace? What do we mean by that? And honestly, when you break it down to its simplest terms, it really is a simple concept. And we really just mean consistent treatment with respect. And, a couple really important words in there: consistent and respect, because it can't be something that just happens from time to time, or on occasion. It has to be the culture that we create, the environment that we create, consistently treating people with respect. And that has to be the driving guideline or principle of the organization. And really, without that, we can't go any further. If we want to look at the other side of the coin and ask, well, what is incivility then? If we're talking about having a civil workplace, what's incivility? And a definition I like of that is low intensity, deviant behavior with ambiguous intent to harm the target. Now, that's way too complex for me to have come up with myself, but I love the idea of it because it really talks about what we mean by incivility. Low intensity, meaning it's not blatant. It's not necessarily an obvious violation of some kind of policy or law. It's a little more, under the radar, so to speak. And the ambiguous intent may not be intentional. It may be, I didn't even know I was doing that. I didn't mean to do that. I didn't intend to do that, but you're doing it and it's harming people. And as that little cartoon shows there, and quite appropriate for being in the middle of a pandemic, incivility is contagious. And if you allow that in your workplace, if you permit that kind of workplace culture, it will spread and it will get worse and it will grow and kind of like an infection, take on and go throughout your organization. So you've got to stop it. Don't confuse it with the more blatant harassment, discrimination. It can lead to that, but that's not what we're talking about right now with the concept of incivility. It's a much more lower level thing like that, or a lower level process than what we're talking about there. So we're going to do a first breakout session, and Zoe's going to pop us into some rooms, but we want to just take about 10 minutes or so to set the stage, from your perspectives, in whatever organizations you've worked in, what you're doing now. What does it mean to you? What does a civil workplace mean to you? And what does it look like? And we're just going to talk about that for about 10 minutes in a group. And then we're going to come back and hopefully debrief. And then we'll get into some more issues of taking a hard look at civility and what it looks like. So we're going to pop you into the breakouts now and see you back in about 10. All right. Slowly coming back.
Those breakouts go quick.
Hey, team 3, what went on in team 3 stays in team 3, okay?
You got it.
Good handshake, Janet.
No sharing, huh?
Go to
Yeah,
silent.
breakouts don't get recorded.
Oh, no, that's right. Darn.
Sounds like things got a little uncivil in team 3.
Yeah, they were civil.
Nay,
Make a
nay.
note of that, Zoe.
Confessions of
maybe.
team 3.
Maybe just more transparent, open, and honest. Let's come on now.
Sounds like Team 3's room needs to be renamed as Vegas.
That's great.
All right. So do we have everyone back?
Yep, everyone's back.
All right. So hopefully you had some fun in there. Sounds like Team 3 did. Anybody want to share a little bit what you talked about, from your experience? What do we mean by civility? What are we talking about? What's it look like in the workplace? Any observations or thoughts that anyone had on that?
Probably liked your definition of incivility
Oh, thank you.
and how it could creep up, even though the intent wasn't there.
Right.
Low-level nastiness, I thought was a good way to.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And a lot of passive aggressive in there too, things like just not acknowledging someone or rudeness or, just stuff that we wouldn't necessarily be overly concerned with in terms of, it's violating policy or it's going to be a legal issue, but it's just not nice.
It led to a union organizing campaign in one of my organizations, AKA, that is the lack of acknowledgement. The top dude was just walking by people as he walked in the hallway, just walking by him. He was totally focused on what he was thinking about, but they perceived that he was ignoring them.
Yeah.
So, so we had a union for a period of time because of it.
That's always a joy.
Yeah. And, it's a 25% cost increase, all sorts of.
Yeah.
You'd
And that's,
like,
oh, go ahead, Brian.
I was going to say, I would like to think that this becomes a self-sorting process, that businesses and leadership teams that tolerate this type of actions and environment are going to lose good people and therefore hurt themselves and become self-limiting. Whether they realize that or not, you'd like to think that would be enough to stop it, but I don't think it is.
Well, I think the key point is what you just said, whether they realize it or not, because you're absolutely right, 100%, but in many cases they don't realize it, and that's the problem. And that's why they end up losing a lot of good people, or getting unions, or creating liability, or just having an unproductive workplace with low morale and poor engagement levels, because they don't realize it. They don't see what it's doing. And that's why, when we'll talk about a little bit more, it has to start with leadership, and there has to be awareness and accountability.
I think that's the most common result, Keith, and it is unacknowledged, or often is unacknowledged, where you don't have people rowing in the same direction. You have a lot of people checking out. You have fiefdoms. You have whatever results out of that, and it's low trust, and the amount of productivity, innovation, and so forth that gets lost in that process is incredible. And whether you're losing people or not, it's a low functioning organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Keith, I'd love to get your perspective and others. I would say one of the key takeaways of the breakout room that I was in was that civility and being respectful can be two different things. And so I gave the example, for those that don't know me, I was CHRO for a Belgium-based company in my last role, and I would say that they were civil, but they weren't respectful. And so I gave a couple examples, but one I gave was, how they talk to you. And in one example, like around the management table, when they didn't want me to hear what they were saying, they would start speaking in Flemish.
You're not fluent?
No, I learned the key words though, that I needed to. But they didn't really respect the U.S. laws, or they didn't respect Americans. I know that, the way they talk down to you. So maybe that's uncivil. But to me, I think you could be civil and disrespectful at the same time, which is what I clearly experienced.
Yeah, and that's I think it's a great point. You kind of lead to the next slide when we get to it, but that's why we talk about civility and respect, exactly for that reason, Mike, because they can be different and they don't necessarily have to be the same thing. But it's an excellent point. Other comments?
Yeah, Keith, I'm glad that you talked about leadership. It has to come from leadership, because over the years, I've heard often that HR is the deciding factor on whether it's a safe, respectful work environment. And and I know that HR doesn't have all this power to make it a civil, respectful work environment if they're not supported by the leaders. And who was that was saying they were in Belgium? I was stationed in Belgium, and I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that was me, Dawn. Would love to connect with you, but yeah.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true. And we'll see a slide a little bit later, like I said, that it has to come from the top. They need to lead from the front. It has to be established clearly from the CEO on down that this is not acceptable conduct. This is the kind of workplace culture or environment we need. And, for anybody out there who's thinking right now, and I don't think any of you are, but in case you are, that, this is just soft stuff. It's just fluff. It's touchy feely. It's not. It's very real, because as so many studies have shown, and as a couple of slides that we'll look at later will show us, the consequences are tremendous, both from a legal perspective, a financial perspective, productivity, turnover, morale, performance. On so many levels. And it starts with this. This is, incivility is like that little speck when you get your MRI or something, and the doctor sees something small of concern. That's what incivility is, because it's going to grow, and it's going to grow if it's unchecked, and if leadership doesn't stand up and say, no, we don't accept that kind of conduct here, it's going to grow into worse things, flat out disrespect and bullying, and then intimidation and harassment and discrimination and all of those things. All of you who have been HR leaders or business leaders, those things are bad for business. It's not just, oh, it's a nice HR thing to talk about. It's bad for business, and it will have an absolute impact on your bottom line if you let it go.
Yeah, Keith, to build on that, I'm thinking of a company that I was part of that I chose to leave, where, ironically, they absolutely had a respectful workplace policy, and that was almost used as a disciplinary tool against people lower in the organization, where literally the business unit leader was the worst offender all the way around. He was definitely his leadership team environment was who's on the hot seat today, that kind of thing. And to your point, it's not just about being nice to each other. That business had 30% turnover in a very competitive, high skilled kind of market where talent is tough, and obviously it did lead to, more litigation and things than I'd ever seen in any other company. So yeah, just kind of
it all ties together. It's absolutely all interrelated. And we could do 2 hours easily just on the legal implications of disrespect in the workplace, but that's not what we're about today. But I mean, that's a very real threat from it, and all of these things are kind of like tentacles that come out of it, and potential bad consequences. And the point is, it's so simple to stop it. We just need to make that decision and to understand that this is the way we're going to do it here, and to be very clear with our workforce what's acceptable and what's not. Any other comments coming out of the breakout? Anybody?
Keith, I just want to make, Keith, it's Mike. I just want to make a really quick point. And it's something that came up in the breakout, and that is that I think we're all, as adults, we know instinctively what the big, no behaviors are at work, the stuff that's going to get us hauled down to HR. And most of us, are wise enough to stay away from that. But when it comes to this notion of what's civil or uncivil, I think what makes it a more complicated issue is the stuff that's not so obvious, the stuff that's not so overt. David gave the example of a workplace where, some people, would comment on other people's lunches, maybe a snarky comment or the use of profanity. Some people thought that's totally cool. This is a laid back, informal environment, but other people were offended, right? This is the gray zone where what's civil behavior for me is perceived not so civil for you. And I think that's something that really bears examination, because when we say, leadership has to clamp down on what's allowed and what's not, well, I started off the discussion by saying it's as simple as following the golden rule, right? But then as we talked a little bit more, I realized maybe not quite as simple as I had thought. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, that's great observation, Mike. Thanks.
Mike, how many times, for us HR folks that have done harassment investigations, and the retort was, "Oh, I was just joking."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like every time, 100%.
Yeah,
indeed.
Good morning, Keith. It's Tricia Stevens.
Hey, Tricia.
Yeah. I actually wanted to make a comment about the last statement you just made around it being so simple. My personal belief is that this is rooted within personal deep change that needs to occur. You can put laws and guidelines and policies and everything, and you may get compliance. But my perspective is it's not so simple to change, because it's coming from the root of people's inner self. Mm-hmm. And that's hard to change. So that was just my thought there on your statement about.
Oh, no, I agree with you totally, Tricia. And I apologize. What I meant was the concept is simple. It's a simple concept of treat people the right way. Yeah, you're absolutely right, though. In practicality and reality, it's very hard, especially to change people. That's why we're here. That's why we have this topic. But I agree with you 100%. But what I meant was, in theory, it should be a simple thing. You just treat people well,
And I wasn't. My statement wasn't about correcting you, Keith.
Oh no, I know.
There's
didn't
no
take it
need
that
to
way.
apologize. I was
I'm
just,
being civil.
yeah.
No, I understood that, Tricia. I was just
And I
trying-
respect that.
There we go. You know,
We'll
it's
get
funny.
your
It's funny
disability
because when I was on the Springfield School Board for 8 years, and you know, sometimes those meetings would get a little bit boisterous, shall we say, and I'd always be the one to kind of put my hand up and say, all right, guys, folks, let's kind of calm down a little bit. And the one of our board members took to calling me the respectoree. He said I'd be holding up yellow cards for everybody because I'd be the one trying to keep them all in check. But you know, one of the comments that was just made made me think too that, you know, when we talk about the golden rule and how it's not as simple as that, we need to also keep in mind, you know, generational changes. And I'm really dating myself now, but before a lot of you got on, we were talking about being old people. So I'm allowed to say that. But I don't know if you guys have noticed this too, but these kids today, they throw language around in the workplace and in more formal settings like we would have never imagined. And it's just, it's not even a second thought to a lot of them. And I've been, not that I'm conservative by any means, especially if I'm out on a baseball field or in union negotiations with language, but there's a time and place for it, as how I was always brought up and raised, and the workplace wasn't necessarily that place. But I've been stunned over the past few years with younger, and I'm talking like mid-20s people who just throw language around in the workplace like they're out at a bar. And it's not necessarily a criticism of that as much as it is it's a generational difference that I've seen that, you know, maybe many of us on this call would have never thought of that. And you wouldn't talk like that at work. And now some people do. That's something that needs to be addressed because it's going to have an impact on the rest of us. So again, and that's another example of, while they may not have meant anything by it, and it's that kind of low grade ambiguous intent thing, someone might be offended if the person in the cubicle next to them is dropping F-bombs every 2 minutes on their phone calls. So we just need to be aware. We need an organizational self-awareness, and we just need to say, you know, it's not a thing where you're sent to HR. I hate that term, I'm being sent to HR. But maybe, you know, your manager or somebody just pulls you aside and says, look, you know, just so you're clear, we try to keep it, you know, a little bit more professional environment here, you know, things like that. But, and that's the point of civility. It's not necessarily intentional. And it's not something that we necessarily look at as saying we need to go to HR over this. This is a policy violation, or this is a legal violation. It doesn't have to be that. It can be much more difficult to address.
Yeah, it's not about the intent of the person
exactly
acting. It's about the impact on the person receiving. And
that's exactly right.
We
Dave.
talked in our breakout room that's changing. That, you know, what's okay to say or do changes over time. And some, you know, so some folks need to catch up, or, you know, we need to be able to talk to each other about what you're saying, because everybody's going to slip up at some point, even with the best intentions.
Yeah.
It's just, if it becomes, you know, a regular thing, that's when you sort of tip the scale the wrong way.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, when I do sexual harassment training, or even in my employment law class at Villanova, when we talk about sexual harassment, that's always one of the big points I make. It's intent is irrelevant. In sexual harassment, it doesn't matter if I say something or do something that has an impact on another person. It's irrelevant whether I meant to offend them, or if I meant to make them feel uncomfortable, or, as someone said earlier, if I was just joking. Or, you know, we've all had that case of, you know, the hugger, you know, the little old guy in the office who's been there for 40 years and he hugs everybody. It's just the way, it's what he does. It's not acceptable if it makes people feel uncomfortable, even though in his mind, it's not something he's trying to make people uncomfortable. So we just need to be aware of all of these things.
Also, follow up on
Janet,
Mike's comment. What I talked about during the breakout was the fact that people, and this goes back to, I think it was Mike also talking about, if I follow the golden rule, I'm fine. but really you have to determine what people feel is respect. So many employees have come to me and said, my supervisor is harassing me, which, of course, as soon as I hear harassment, I'm in the legal definition.
Yeah.
And well, that my supervisor hasn't respected me. Well, tell me what you mean by that. One of the things that Mark did in his at his team level is he brought his people together and had a team meeting in the morning and said, okay, speak up, everybody. What do we have to do today? How are we going to get it done? And it helped people engage, and it, encouraged people to provide their opinion. And, it helps to make people understand, what does respect look like? What does, for me, and it's not just a golden rule. So.
Yeah, absolutely true.
Keith, this did not come out of the breakout, and leadership is critical. I think that's true, and I get a little concerned about that it's easy to let ourselves off the hook, right? So we're all impacted by the culture of an organization or our neighborhoods or whatever, right? And we're all contributing to it. So, and our ability and our to retain and continue to try and expand our awareness and so forth. And, are we helping? Are we hurting? Are we contributing to? Or are we taken away? I think is really important. I mean, there's a diligence to this, and really easy to look out at everybody else, and it's equally important to look inward, I think. So
yeah, that's absolutely right. And when I do respectful workplace training, I have 2 sessions. One is for managers, and it's kind of a half day, and it's your role as a leader creating a respectful workplace. And then the other one for non-managers, which is only about 2 hours, it's called A Respectful Workplace, Everyone's Right, Everyone's Responsibility. And I think that gets to your point exactly, which is, it is all of our responsibility to create it and maintain it, no matter what level we're at. We have the right to work in a respectful workplace, and we also have the responsibility to make sure that we're acting in accordance with what we mean by a respectful workplace. But we need to understand, as you pointed out, what that definition is, and what do we mean when we talk about what is a respectful workplace. Any other comments out of that breakout? That was good discussion. Otherwise, we'll keep moving. All right, so here's where we get this intersection of civility and respect, like Mike brought up, I think, earlier. So if we come up with a definition of a respectful workplace, one that I came up with is a workplace in a work environment where employees are respectful and considerate in their interactions with each other, as well as with customers, clients, vendors, and the public. Trust, honesty, and empathy. And it really comes down to respect, treating each other the right way. To your point, Mike Rivera, not speaking Flemish in front of others when you want to talk about them. And there is a difference between being respectful and being civil. But if you treat people respectfully and with consideration and with empathy, and you build trust, I think those are some of the key elements that we need to make sure we have in place. And again, it sounds simple, it sounds basic, but as we all know, it's not. And, I'd love to, again, not getting into the realm of politics, but I'd love to take a bunch of clips of Congress and some of their tweets over the past 6 months to each other, and put that in the context of, if this is your company and people are acting like this, what would you do about it? It just wouldn't be tolerated. And it scares me a little bit, to be honest, to see that that's what's being modeled for us, on the big stage. And I'm afraid that some people will see that and take that as, okay, we can act that way at work as well. So I think it's extra onus on us as leaders, as HR, as members of leadership teams within the workforce or at a workplace, to really establish what is and what is not acceptable. And I think these numbers back that up. And it's kind of interesting because a survey of CEOs and CFOs, 85% of them agree that an unhealthy culture leads to unethical behavior. And again, we're crossing over a line once we start talking about unethical behavior, then we get into legal issues and potentially criminal issues and all kinds of bad stuff. But there's a pretty clear understanding among a majority of CEOs and CFOs that if you have an unhealthy culture, that's where it starts. This unhealthy culture then moves up to lead to unethical behavior. I thought the second number there was kind of fascinating to show how employees really value a respectful and safe work environment. 65% would take lower pay over a bad workplace environment. It's that important to them that they would sacrifice some pay to work in a respectful culture. And then sadly, 45% of employees believe that leadership is minimally or not at all committed to improving culture. And that kind of goes against number one, right? A little bit. If you've got these CEOs and CFOs who are so convinced that an unhealthy culture will lead to bad things, less than half of the employees polled believe that leadership is committed, even minimally, to improving the culture. So there's kind of a push and pull there that we need to get behind and understand. But I think clearly it shows that there's awareness on the part of a lot of leaders. There's absolutely an interest by a lot of employees, and there's a disconnect at some point of putting that awareness into making it a reality. And if you guys have comments or questions at any time on any of these, feel free, please. I don't want this to just be talking at you. I want it to be a discussion. So feel free to jump in with experiences or thoughts on any of this.
I think there was a question, Keith, on where those stats are from.
I'd have to go back and check. I don't have the source with me, but I can.
No problem.
I can find it if you'd like.
No problem. Thanks.
Yep. All right. So we talked about incivility, and these are, some of the things a couple people have brought up earlier. But what are we talking about by incivility? And it could. There's a range. There's a wide range of behavior that falls into it, and a lot of these things, as you see on there, wouldn't necessarily be the type of thing that you would be called to HR about, or that HR would have to deal with. Potentially they could. Offensive jokes, maybe they could. But things like rudeness or just being insensitive, or not acknowledging somebody when you sit down next to them or when you come into work and you walk right past them. Social inclusion, grabbing a coffee or picking up Starbucks for a couple of your colleagues and not asking a third one if they want it. Big one, being on your cell phone during a meeting. And in my last company, we took the step of banning cell phones and computers because we found that people were saying they were using their computers to take meeting notes. And when you'd walk around behind them, you'd see them doing like Candy Crush. So we just said, just take them out of there, focus, be here, be present. As Andy Reid used to say, be where your feet are. But, being on your cell phone during a meeting, texting while you're talking to someone, gossiping or spreading rumors about them, or just intimidating behavior. I mean, you can see how all of these things are potentially low grade, as we called them earlier. And they're not the kind of thing that you can real easily point to as, hey, this is inappropriate conduct. This is violating a policy. This is potentially unlawful behavior, but it has the ability to lead to that. And that's what we're concerned about. And I've got my little Michael Scott down there. I try to work the office into as much as I can. Because I think what I'd love to do is teach a whole course on HR, just using clips from the office. I think it would give me more material than I could ever use. So the problem is that it can escalate. And while incivility can often be low grade and kind of passive aggressive, it can spread, and it can spread like an infection and get worse and get more serious. And if it's unchecked and if it's accepted in the workplace, it can lead to bullying. And we talked about this, and Dawn, when I was on your program the first time, you asked me to define bullying. And it was a good question because it's something we talk about all the time. We talk about it in schools, we talk about it at the workplace, but what does it mean? So I came up with this. I'm sure I didn't invent it myself, but I came up with this definition that I think is a pretty good approach, and I'd love commentary on it too, because we can add to it. But a persistent pattern of disrespect from others. And it could be a boss or lateral in the workplace that causes harm. It can include things that are verbal or nonverbal, psychological or physical. And, to me, it's always, there's this element of either greater power, greater strength, or perceived greater power or greater strength to be a bully. It's, when you're little, it's the big kid who's bigger than you. In a meeting, maybe it's the big loud person or the boss or somebody, but it doesn't have to be. So that's why I say it could be potentially perceived power or strength. But in that person's mind, in that bully's mind, at least, they're more intimidating than you. Any thoughts, any other thoughts on how you would add to or supplement that? Because when Dawn asked me that question, it really got me thinking, and it was tough to define bullying.
Keith, I want to jump in. You have a persistent pattern of disrespect. Could it not be singular?
It could be, yeah, but usually bullies are bullies, and
yeah, true.
So, but yeah, it could. I mean, I could bully you once, but typically, at least in my experience, it's a personality trait that unfortunately is repeated, which is why the persistent came in the pattern. But yeah, I mean, it could be a one-time thing.
So I have to admit that in the breakout meeting, one of the things that I admitted to being was a bully. But
you, Janet?
Yeah, reading this description, I disavow that. But what it was precipitated by Morris saying, you have a supervisor who says, not when can you get this done, but you will have this done by Tuesday, et cetera. And that is kind of my MO. So I think the psychological, physical, and humiliation abuse is just, that's definitely, really not a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's how it's delivered, right?
Yeah, I mean, tone is a lot of it.
Right, because for you as a supervisor to set an expectation of time frame, it's really how it's delivered, is whether it's bullying or not, right? I just want to watch the line in which we take as to what extreme is really something terrible.
Well, yeah, because absolutely, as a leader, I mean, part of your job is to do that, right? It's to set deadlines, and it's to set expectations and tell, Brian, I'll need this by Tuesday. But how you do it, how you phrase it, the tone you use, the approach you take, that's where we get to, are we getting into bullying behavior? And Mike, I know you wanted to say something, but let me just add, when I was a young lawyer here in Philly, we had a partner who was an absolute bully. And this guy was just evil. And one of his tactics, it's true. One of his tactics was, we'd be working, it'd be like a Friday, and he'd say, all right, we need this brief done. You two, pointing at me and somebody else, you two, I'll see you in here tomorrow morning at 8:00, and we'll work for a few hours. So Saturday morning at 8:00, we'll work for a few hours and get this thing done. And I'll take a look at what you've done so far. So we're like, geez, great. We got to go in at 8:00 on a Saturday morning, but it's part of the job. Okay. So we get there, we wait, nothing from him. Around 9:00, we get a phone call. Yeah, something came up. I'm not going to be able to make it today. We'll talk about it on Monday. And it wasn't just a one-time thing. He had a pattern of doing this. He would do that to people who he had power over. And he would do it just to establish his power, to say, hey, I can make you come in on a Saturday morning at 8:00, even though I have no intention of joining you there. And I don't need you to do anything, but I can insert myself into your life like that. That's bullying, Mike, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to make 2 points, and I know leaders like that. They don't follow their company's values and principles. But 2 points I wanted to make, and you talked about earlier generational differences in the workplace, and I do think that expectations, and having two daughters that are in the workplace in their early 20s, early to mid 20s, their expectations, I think, are different from other generations in terms of what would constitute bullying and what is appropriate versus inappropriate. But the more important point I wanted to make is some key takeaways. And earlier we talked about intent versus impact, which is something to remember. And the other one is that we're kind of talking about is profits over people. And I think there's so much pressure today. I mean, the average CEO's tenure anymore is 3 years. And there's a lot of pressure in the workplace, unlike I think ever before, to perform and make money. And so how many companies would have the fortitude to terminate a top performer? And I'm talking about where there was clear bullying, clear pattern of intimidation, clear pattern of harassment. But if they were a top earner, top salesperson in a company, or they ran a profitable plant, and I've seen this firsthand, how many companies would actually take action where they should? And most companies don't, right? And we know that.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you raised that point, and I'm going to ask you to wait till the very last slide for me to address that. But you're absolutely right. That's a key part of this for sure. All right. So legal implications.
I also think there it is a pattern. I think it is a pattern. Unlike Don, I'm not sure. I mean, you can have the harassment screech, but I really do think that a bully is a patterned individual. So,
yeah, I would tend to agree with that as well. On the legal implication side, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because, as I said, that's for another day. But this whole idea of civility, and even the word civility in the workplace, it's relatively new to a lot of us. Respectful workplace has been around a long time. Civility, not so much. It really came out of this EEOC task force report that was an 18-month study that came out in 2016. It included lawyers and advocacy groups and academia and corporate representatives. And the EEOC spent 18 months looking at civility and harassment in the workplace. And a couple of their key takeaways shouldn't be shocking to us, but harassment remains a persistent problem. It too often goes unreported. There's a compelling business case for stopping and preventing it. And it starts at the top. And it all comes down to leadership and accountability. And I think those are all very obvious, but I don't know that it took an 18-month study to figure those things out, but that's what they concluded. And the key, and this is where this concept really came from, they concluded in their report that incivility is a gateway drug to harassment. And again, so connect the dots here. The EEOC is in charge of enforcing Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits harassment in the workplace. So for them to come up with this concept and to come right out and say incivility is a gateway drug to harassment, that's really kind of what put this concept on the map, that harassment starts with incivility in the workplace. And I like this kind of inverted pyramid here to kind of demonstrate this. And we start with incivility at the bottom. And as I said, that can be relatively low grade and under the radar, but it can move up to disrespect, intimidating behavior, bullying behavior. And then it gets up to a real dangerous level of legal liability, things like harassment, retaliation, verbal and physical assault. And, harassment is the big one right now. It's still over a third of all the cases filed in with the EEOC are sexual harassment cases. We've seen, far too often on the news over the last few years, high level cases, and multiply that by several multipliers to see what that's looking like in the workplace. I've talked to so many people who are dealing with sexual harassment, and Janet, I forget if it was you or someone else made the comment earlier, if somebody mentions the word harassment. And the thing is with employees, they understand the term, well, I shouldn't say they understand, they recognize the term hostile environment, and they know that it makes HR people jump. So they know enough to be dangerous. So when they go in and they say, I'm being harassed, or it's a hostile environment, everybody panics and freaks out. But we've got to take a step back and say, all right, talk to me about what's happening, because what I've found more often than not, it's not a hostile environment. That's a specific legal term.
Exactly.
Maybe it's your manager's being unfair to you, or your manager's being mean to you, or your manager's expecting you to work 8 hours a day. Mm-hmm. And in your mind, that's a hostile environment. So we need to dig a little deeper when people say that. But you're absolutely right that they throw those words around. They toss harassment and hostile environment around because they know it'll get a reaction. And it often does. So we need to ask ourselves what, and this is kind of one of our first breakout question talked about a little bit, but what does a civil and respectful workplace look like? Showing esteem, care, consideration for others in the workplace, recognizing the dignity and the inherent value that all of us have as individuals in the workplace. And it really comes down to display of empathy and empathetic organizations. So effective teamwork, common courtesy. Conflicts are not bad. Conflicts by themselves are not bad. It's how they're resolved and how they're handled that can be bad. But conflict happens in every relationship, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, a work relationship. It's how we effectively resolve a conflict. And if we do it the right way and in a positive and healthy and constructive way. Respectful leadership at all levels, not just the top, but at every level. Treating each other with respect and showing empathy in our dealings with other colleagues. And why is it important? A number of studies have shown that, and this is kind of where we started off, that it leads to greater job satisfaction. This is having a respectful workplace environment. There's more perception of fairness. And, remember, fairness is not required by the law. The law doesn't require companies or bosses to be fair necessarily. If they're being unfair because of a protected characteristic, that's different. So if they're treating women poorly and treating men well, they're being unfair to women, that's a problem. But if you're just generally a jerk, we used to call it the Newt Rockney defense. People today probably wouldn't even know what we were talking about. But back in the day when I was practicing, it was not the defense you'd want to make, but it was basically, he's a jerk to everybody. That's our defense of this manager. He's not discriminating against a particular group. He's just a jerk to everybody. That is your absolute last resort defense. Trust me on that one. That's not one that you're comfortable going in front of a jury and saying, "Hey, sorry, but this guy's just an asshole to everybody." No offense, but I'm going to use that word later in a clinical context. So improved morale, better teamwork, greater interest in personal development, engagement, problem resolution. All of these things result from and come out of having a civil and respectful workplace. And the bottom line, our absenteeism will be down, our turnover will be down, our legal risks will be reduced. We'll see greater productivity as an organization, and there's going to be higher levels of trust. So all of these things are clearly benefits to the organization, and many of them can be converted to financial terms, to look at the impact potentially on an organization. There have been a lot of studies on the cost of turnover, and a lot of you who have been HR leaders have seen a number of them. I don't know, which ones I necessarily believed. Does it cost 4 times a person's annual salary to replace them? And you see all kinds of numbers on there, and I don't know how you necessarily fix a formula to it. But the point is that it is expensive. You've got to go through the process of advertising a job, posting it, going through the application process, bringing candidates in for interviews. That's a lot of people time involved in that, a lot of managers' time away from doing their jobs, costs of the process, and then making an offer, getting someone hired and bringing them up to speed so that they're at a productive level. I mean, that all has an impact on the organization. So every time you lose somebody, you've got to go through all that. And that's not necessarily a good recipe for a productive work environment. All right, we're going to get
Keith.
Yeah, right.
About a couple slides back, when we think about what bullying is or isn't, and what harassment is or isn't, and you made some points about what is not bullying. I was thinking through my long career, like being annoying isn't bullying, being demanding isn't bullying. There are a lot of things that are not, but another thing that we don't, I don't know if it fits in anywhere, but we don't seem to teach in organizations is how to encourage or teach people to stay in their own lane, because egos come into this a lot. And so people tend to get out of their lane in leadership meetings. I sit in a lot of leadership meetings, and I'm guilty of getting out of my lane. And sometimes it's okay to get out of your lane, like, pushing back sometimes is okay. It's, as you said, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. Pushing back can be okay, getting out of your lane. But how do you get out of your lane? Like, we don't teach people and including, or maybe especially managers, we don't teach them how you can respectfully get out of your lane and make a suggestion in another area. And I know it's something that my boss encourages me to do amongst the leadership team is I come at it from a very different perspective, and he wants to hear it, but I need to still be respectful and polite in the way I do that. So there's other nuances to this that I'm not sure come up enough. And I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, it's a great point, Jory. Thanks. And I think you're absolutely right. And in the leadership teams I've been involved in that have been really highly performing, that's been a hallmark of it is, you'd have somebody make a comment or a suggestion or ask a question that's not in their area, but they do it in a respectful way and in a constructive way and in a way that it doesn't feel like they're overstepping or imposing their will. They're just trying to get to a better solution for everybody. And that's a culture that has to be created and fostered by the leader. But you're absolutely right. And, sometimes we get that apparent contradiction of we don't want to be siloed. Everybody get out of your silos. And then at the same time, we're saying stay in your lanes. So it's kind of finding that middle ground, I think, of like you said, the healthy way of expressing and truly highly functioning leadership teams. That's what they're going to do. So we're going to go to a second breakout. Zoe, can we make this 10 minutes instead of the original 15 we had in mind?
Yep, we can do that.
Because we're getting low on time here. But two questions here on this one. We mentioned earlier that, and this has been, in the forefront, especially if you followed the Harvey Weinstein or Justice Kavanaugh hearings, or anything really related to kind of high level allegations of sexual harassment. Some of the people who really pushed back and were cynical about the claims that were made said, well, if this happened, they would have reported it right away. The fact that these women didn't come forward and report this behavior probably means it didn't happen and they're making it up. So one of the questions is, what are some reasons that employees might be hesitant to come forward with complaints, whether it's harassment or just bullying or just incivility? Why might people be hesitant to bring that to someone's attention? And then what are some steps you've taken in your organization to create a respectful workplace? So we're just going to talk, we'll go 10 minutes on this one, and then we'll come back and finish up the session and hopefully leave time for a couple of questions. All right. Everyone back?
Yeah, we probably don't have much time for conversation.
We don't. But hopefully you had
it was great
breakout session.
Yeah,
and hopefully you came up with some of these reasons. This is, some of the more common reasons that the people don't come forward. The fear that it won't be taken seriously or they won't be believed, especially if it's someone in power, someone highly ranked in an organization. Fear that they'll be retaliated against, being labeled as a complainer, a troublemaker, sensitive. They'll start blaming themselves, questioning whether they were responsible for it, afraid of what they might lose, client, their job, their marriage, their reputation, and embarrassment. And it takes quite an emotional toll on people to actually take that brave step of coming forward and saying, I've been harassed or I've been bullied or whatever it might be. So I'm going to go through real quick so we get finished on time. But so how do we get there? We know where we need to be. How do we get there? It really should be simple, as we said, start with the common courtesies. But unfortunately, courtesy is not so common anymore. And, it's something that we really need. We forget about the basics, the stuff we all learned on Sesame Street or before. Saying good morning and hello to people, please, thank you, I'm sorry. I mean, the basic stuff, but it's a starting point. It might sound like, well, that doesn't change your culture, but it does if you start with that. If that's where you start, respectful communications, really listening to people in conversations, the tone, we've talked about that, the volume, how you present things, your approach that you take to employees and coworkers, your body language, being on personal calls or texting, in meetings, have some meeting etiquette in there in terms of interrupting each other and talking over each other. Put the phones away, focus, be there where you are, ask relevant questions. Like we talked about, staying in your lane. If you're going to add to it respectfully and professionally. And if you need to address something with someone, don't just pop up and hit them in the hallway. Ask if it's a good time to talk, schedule an appointment. find a private spot and address the situation, because like I said, conflict will happen everywhere. It's a matter of dealing with it the right way, being professional, dealing with it in a private and appropriate manner. Thinking before speaking. I want to highlight writing, because how many of us have fired off emails that we've then regretted. It's so easy right now to text or email something when you're hot and angry. We used to write the letter and not send it. Remember that whole thing? And then throw it out if you change your mind. Now you just
we call that the flame.
Yeah, exactly. Now you got this email and you hit send and ouch, it's out. But it really does come down to leadership, setting the tone in the organization, making it clear what's acceptable, what's not, holding people accountable if they're not acting in the way you need them to be, and being empathetic. The consequences can be tremendous. We've talked about a lot of these, so I'm not going to read through them all, but the consequences of incivility in the workplace to the employer, it's all bad stuff. And, you've heard the term all publicity is good publicity. I don't think that UPS or SoFi or Uber would agree when you see headlines like these. So the bottom line, treat others with respect, think before you act, be aware, be self-aware of how others are being treated, understand your policies, communicate with honesty, and treat others with respect. That's not a typo, it's on there twice because it's so important. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'd say asshole again. So I don't know if any of you have read this book or not. It's one of my favorites and I recommend it to everyone. I didn't know how many people we'd have. All right, Janet's got it. I didn't know how many people we'd have on here. So I was going to say, anybody who's interested, I'll send you a free copy. And I was going to pick 10 at random, but we only have like 10 on here. So if anybody wants one, just shoot me an email with your address. I happen to have bought a box of them just because I think it's so good, but it's all about this. And it's all about what was raised earlier about not tolerating that high performer or that great salesperson or that, top performing lawyer who's just a jerk to everyone. You got to make that business decision and prioritize that. But it's Bob Sutton's a professor at Stanford. He wrote this article for the Harvard Business Review. Didn't think they would publish it, being called the no asshole rule, but to his shock, they did. Because first they tried to get him to water it down, but he said the no jerk rule or the no meanie rule didn't really work. So they published it that way. He turned it into a book. It's an easy read. It's a quick read, but I think it's so powerful in talking about a civilized workplace. So feel free to shoot me your email or shoot me an email with your address and I'll get one sent out to you. And that's it. I got 9:26. So any questions or final comments before I let y'all out of here? I want to thank you again so much for giving me the opportunity today and hope we got some value out of this.
It was good, Keith. For a
Really
guy who
good.
runs business units, I'm not used to being in the room with this many HR people.
It's scary, isn't it?
Coffee.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been around so many HR.
We're not that bad.
Hey Keith, one you had it on one slide. In meetings, like you since I've gotten to know you, you have a very low key kind of tone of voice, right? I'm Italian, I'm loud. So in meetings, I get accused of being loud, and people take it the wrong way. And it reminds me of that Kevin Hart commercial. Hey, I'm right here. Why are you shouting?
Yeah.
What I do.
Right.
And I have to consciously throttle it back these days because I'm passionate and Italian and loud.
Yeah.
Nothing to be ashamed of, Mark.
No.
Loud and proud.
Loud and proud.
Does that mean, though, that you have to stifle your normal self in order to fit in?
A little bit.
Well, in the last couple of roles, I've been the leader, so they've got to.
I think you have to be aware of it, Morris. I don't know about stifling, but being aware of it. And we were talking in the breakout, Zoe and I and Mike. Sometimes it's just about getting to know you, getting to know your personality. And if it's your first week on the job and Mark is yelling and screaming and waving his arms, you might think he's some nut. But once you get to know him a little bit and you realize, oh, he's Italian. I can say that because I'm half Italian. I'm Bruno on my mom's side. But yeah, I mean, you do have to to adjust sometimes. I don't know that it means stifle yourself, but you do need to take into account how you're impacting other people. But the other side of that is once they get to know you a little bit and they appreciate that it's just your style and you're not being a jerk and you're not, intimidating them, then that all kind of works itself out.
One of the leadership traits that I always thought was important is that you have to let people see your human side too, not just your boss side. And once they see your human side and you pick on yourself just like you pick on them, then people loosen up a little bit.
Yep.
And you know what, Mark? I think passions and emotions are okay.
Yeah.
They're
Absolutely.
okay, and they're okay in the workplace. And a lot of times training is focused on top down, and it really needs to be both ways, right?
When I was much younger, and I tried not to wear my heart on my sleeve. I didn't know how to stop wearing my heart on my sleeve. And as I got older, I just said, I wear my heart on my sleeve. That's the way it is.
Got to be authentic to yourself.
Can't hide it. I haven't been able to hide it for 30 years, so I'm not hiding it now.
There's also a difference between being demonstrative and being an asshole, right?
Yes.
So nothing wrong with being outward in your movements and your voice. That's fine. That's a stylistic thing. But when that teeters over into just being a jerk, then that's something else entirely, I think.
Beacon is the premier executive networking organization serving the Mid-Atlantic region. To learn more, go to beaconforlife.org.